think I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to our May SEPAC meeting. We're almost to the end of the school year. How's everyone doing? People are smiling. That's okay. I'll take that as a good sign. I'm Judith and Meg is here too. Meg, you want to say hi?
Hi, everyone. I don't know if you can hear me. Can you?
Where are you, Meg?
I'm sitting outside. I mean, I think in these days when everyone's home, you have to find a space that's quiet and away. And I'm in the backyard, kind of hiding from my.
It's beautiful. I'm going to walk down the street and come hang out with you.
Yeah, exactly. Finally.
Yeah, I'm actually in my car, so I don't have such a nice background. All right. Well, I always like to remind everyone of the purpose of a SEPAC. It's mandated by state law, and it's really important to have an organization that works in the best interest of students who are on IEPs and 504 plans, to talk with the administration, to work with the community, to provide information. So we're a small but mighty group. So thanks everyone for being part of SEPAC. And I would say too, I'm already thinking about next year, and it'll be interesting to see what it's like to have meetings, and if we're able to gather together in person. I'm assuming we'll be able to, but I also want to put the word out for volunteers. If anyone wants to get involved in leadership or help us organize, and just continue to make things better and better with the DSCPAC, we welcome that. So please just send an email to us. I'll have the contact information up in just a second. So today I have already provided our brief announcements. I don't know, Meg, do you have anything you need to share?
No, just the same sentiment that anyone who has any ideas for speakers or people from the DS school system you want to hear speaking, just send them to Judith or I. Judith and I have bounced around a bunch of ideas, but certainly having college kids now, I'm sort of a little bit out of the loop about what's kind of relevant. And so, yeah, that's my only thought, is just send us ideas so that we can, make sure we address anything you want to hear about or anyone you want to hear from, especially at the school. And I know moving forward into the fall, things are going to start to normalize, and there's going to be, sort of, I think, maybe issues around that. So, we can certainly address some of those things.
Yeah, we want to be supportive. Also too, just as a reminder, there is an election going on with the school committee. So make sure and vote on Monday. I'm not going to tell you who to vote for, but definitely please take time to go and vote on Monday. And then also too, there's activity going on around the selection of an interim superintendent, and then, the superintendent search itself. And these have, implications on our students. So be thinking about that too, and how we can be engaged moving forward. And Kate, I know you're here, and I don't want to put you on the spot, although I'm putting you on the spot. Do you want to say hi to everybody just quickly? And I don't know if you have any updates or anything you need to share.
I don't have many updates. It's good to see. I know most of the names on the list. So hi to everybody. Thank you for having me. I do have to jump off at 11 for a meeting here at Chickering, but people should always feel welcome reaching out if you have questions. I know a couple families have reached out to me directly. And for elementary level, Naomi O'Brien is a great contact, and Steve Goodwin at the middle and the high school too. But if you have any questions, I'm always here. And we work all through the summer too. So if anything comes up in the summer, always feel free to reach out to us.
Fantastic. Yeah. Summer is right around the corner. Hooray. Hooray. All right. Okay. Anything else before we move on? Okay. So Jane, don't kill me, but I think I'm going to put you on the spot if you don't mind. We're so glad to have Sophie with us, but I'd love it if you would give her a nice introduction. So
sure.
Okay.
So thanks for having us. So Sophie and I both work at NESCA, which is Neuropsychology and Education Services for Children and Adolescents. It's based in Newton, Plainville, Massachusetts, and Londonderry, New Hampshire. And Sophie Bellenis is one of our amazing occupational therapists, and she also is the program manager for our real life skills coaching. And I have continually learned tons of stuff from Sophie. It's like every single day there's something new. So without further ado, I will pass things over to Sophie and hope you guys get a lot out of the presentation.
Thank you, Jane. I learned from you as well.
So Sophie, really quickly, I've cut you right off. I apologize, but I think you can share your screen now. And then my only request is as people come into the waiting room, you'll need to let them in if you see that pop up, because you are now the host. So
I can make that happen. I will try and keep an eye on it.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. So, hi everybody. I'm Sophie Bellenis. As Jane mentioned, I'm an occupational therapist. I do have a history working in schools, kind of across the continuum. So I've done elementary, middle, high school, out of district placement. So I've kind of run the gamut in schools, and I've transitioned now into more of this adolescent executive function and real life skills coaching program. And I'm really interested in this sort of developmental approach to executive function in the home, mostly because I feel like every time I have a new student, I think, if only we had started working on this 10 years ago. So I really like to kind of focus in on how we can start young, the specific skills to be looking at as early as possible, and just really how to support kids throughout childhood and that transition into adolescence, which leads to that transition into young adulthood. So I will share my screen. Give me just one moment. Oh, I do this every day, I promise. Okay, so now I'm gonna get in slideshow view. Can everybody see my title slide?
Yes.
Fabulous, thank you. So I guess we'll just jump right in. Let me just figure out how to go forward. Oh, there we go, got it. So I'll start with the objectives for today. I really want to just kind of define what executive function is. It's very amorphous, and it encompasses so many different things that I think it's hard to really pin down an exact definition, but we'll do our best. We'll review kind of school-based EF supports. I always say that when it comes to executive function, our teachers are our masters and we need to learn from them. We'll talk a little bit about helping versus taking over with some of these skills, which is a really hard line to walk. Then we'll go into like kind of EF for life. We'll talk about specific skills and strategies for them. And then we'll review the cycle of executive dysfunction and how kind of having weaknesses in these areas make it really difficult, and it can get kind of cyclical. So I'll start off with the Merriam-Webster definition of executive function. It's a group of complex mental processes and cognitive abilities that controls the skills required for goal-directed behavior. That's really, I would say it's really unclear. It doesn't really jump into kind of like what these skills actually do, but it gives a little bit of a definition. It talks about what goes into it. You know, if you've read neuropsychs, you know that you're going to get information about working memory. You're going to get information about some of this kind of skill bases that kids have, and it really is looking for that goal-directed behavior. So I actually like this definition, which is more of an explanation than a definition, more than kind of the cut and dry definition. And I will read it out loud. It was written by a neuropsychologist at NESCA, but I just love the way she described it. Executive functioning can be considered the conductor of all cognitive skills. Research has shown that executive function and self-regulation skills are critical for learning and development and help a person manage life tasks of all types. While humans are not born with executive function skills, we are born with the potential to develop them. Moreover, studies show that we can continue developing the skills throughout our lifespan. So this is definitely something that starts right when we're born and goes all the way through. I am absolutely still learning executive functioning skills myself. It's something that we just kind of need to keep working on continuously. I want to jump right in to a very quick clip because I love the way that this video explains what happens in the brain during this development of executive function. So if I can be tech savvy for a moment, I'm going to pull this up. I'm going to check there's no one in the waiting room. All right. And okay, make sure I'm sharing sound. Okay.
How does executive function develop?
6, 7, 7, and plus 4.
In little children, and even, in the infant and toddler years, you begin to see the roots of executive functioning skills. What's going on in our brains is unbelievably intricate and complicated.
The prefrontal cortex, or the front third of the brain, is important for executive function. But it's more than just prefrontal cortex. This region doesn't act alone. It's involved in controlling your behavior through its interactions with all other parts of the brain. The brain goes from a situation where you've got nearest neurons communicating very strongly with each other and ignoring the rest of the brain, to these widespread networks that are connecting these different areas. Executive function changes over the life course. It improves radically over the first few years.
I got a match prime.
It continues to improve throughout adolescence. It's not until early adulthood that you have the adult-type networks that are very strongly activated that connect different brain regions together.
Let's take notes.
Also, we believe that executive functions can be trained.
It's just like going to the gym. So the more you practice in these areas, the stronger the capacity is likely to become, because you're hoping to strengthen those neural connections.
You're at 24.
Slowly but surely, you're going to be able to step back, and that child's going to go into the world with these skills where they can get along with other people, change rules, and they can be flexible, and they can accomplish new things, and they're unafraid.
I got bit by my dog in my arm. Oh dear.
If we don't learn these skills during the childhood and adolescent years when they're coming online, we are really ill-equipped as an adult to hold a job, to maintain a marriage, to raise children, to get along with each other, to basically be part of a civil society.
You're okay.
So I just like showing that clip because it gives a little bit of information about kind of building that web of neurons, and how the more we practice it, the better we're going to be able to communicate between those, and the more our frontal lobe is able to act in that goal-directed and self-directed way. So we'll jump back into the presentation. Okay, here we go. So moving on, I want to just kind of highlight how executive function is targeted in the school system, and how our teachers work in this really intentional way to kind of start building skills and then scaffold through while decreasing the direct support. If we look at an elementary school executive function support, we have lots of visuals for the daily schedule, visuals for the weekly schedule. There's a timer that's really helping with that time management piece. Lots of things are color coded, and there's even like color coded self-regulation curriculums. It's really intentional. Here are some examples of things that you might see walking into a typical classroom. And all of these are targeting the executive function piece. You know, it's not that academic piece of learning. It's not spelling and math facts. It's really that EF piece and that self-regulation ability to act as a student in a classroom. When we go to middle school, we have things more like a weekly planner or a weekly schedule. Students start to be in charge of their binders. They start practicing with graphic organizers for writing. They have a locker they're in charge of. Some of their supports look like this. You know, it's more of a block schedule. They might have a checklist, but it's starting to become more self-directed. It's starting to be something that they're more in charge of. And then when we get to high school, we end up seeing kind of like this big jump in independence, and they have to really have, you know, things in their backpack, and they're figuring out their schedule. Eventually they'll be driving. You know, prior March 2020. This was when we started to see a big switch to a digital medium. Now kids have switched pretty early. But you're seeing this need increase in executive function for life skills. You know, they don't always get picked up at 3 p.m. by a parent or a caregiver. They might be figuring out some of their own after school plans and navigating how to get a ride or how to contact somebody to get somewhere. So before we move on, I just want to talk about like one specific skill and show how that skill is built. The executive function piece of that skill is built throughout the sort of continuum of learning. So I'll start with writing a paper. This is something that students need to be able to do before they go off to college. It's something I work on the executive function piece of a lot in coaching sessions. Not necessarily the writing and the graphic organizer, but the like, when do you need to do things? So if you're looking at like this sandwich or the burger of writing a sentence, that's where you often start. You'll see that in the elementary grades. You'll see students like figuring out a topic sentence, figuring out the body sentences, and they follow this plan to how to build a paragraph. Then that evolves into following a similar plan, although a little bit more mature. If you look at this center image to create an essay. When you're in middle school and you're transitioning to high school, you often see these teacher-led internal deadlines. So let's say the whole class has to turn in their outline by March 1st, their rough draft by March 10th, and their final draft by March 15th. That's teacher-led. They're teaching them how to have an internal deadline, how to work on something in steps and break down large assignments. And then eventually in high school, maybe teachers are just asking for a rough draft, and then they expect students to be able to kind of organize that process on their own. And eventually what you need to be able to do, if you're in college or if you're taking a class after high school, you're expected to do it on your own. Students are expected to be able to set their own internal deadlines. And, you know, the better they are with this, the less you have the nights to 3 a.m. in the library trying to figure out getting a paper done the night before it's due. So I think what I'm highlighting here is that it's really intentional. It starts in a really young grades and it grows through this high school learning. I think a lot of times we don't see that because we just have a student with a teacher for a year, but that teacher really does fit in to an intentional path of growth to building this skill for independent executive function. So if we're talking about executive function for life, the first thing I want to talk about is kind of what that means, because it's so vast. It feels really big, and it is. It covers a lot of different skills. But if we look at these skills, there's still that continuum. There's still that growth that can start really young and really, really small, and then can build to this independence. And the best way I can always think of describing like the executive function skills that we end up needing for life are just think about what you do. Like you as a parent or as a caregiver do so much throughout the day, throughout the week, and there's so many different things you're in charge of. The reality is that most of those things are what a young adult's eventually going to need to be in charge of. I don't know how many of you feel like this image. I tend to think it's pretty accurate sometimes. But it really is figuring out all the different things that you're in charge of, which is a lot of different things, I'm sure. You know, it's planning and packing meals, it's figuring out everyone's schedules, it's cleaning, it's tidying, it's making sure that you're bringing in all the things you need for home maintenance, like a plumber, or figuring out the cable, it's paying bills, it's laundry. For some of our students and families, there's prescriptions and pill boxes, and then it's just really being able to plan the day, the week, the month, the year. Just, you guys know what you're in charge of better than I do, but I'm sure it's a lot. You know, that's sort of the definition of being a parent in a lot of ways, is that you have a lot of things to be in charge of and to run your homes. And I think it's really important to think about what our students are going to have to do eventually, because you know what they have to do, because it's what you do in a lot of ways. So I think I've touched on this, but I really feel like the most important thing is time. The most important thing is figuring out, like, how can I start to drop in little bits of learning early? Some of our students will absorb all of the skills, strategies, systems, and routines. I think we often think that that's a lot of our students. It isn't. Those students are not in the majority, those like naturally fantastic executive function kids who just seem to have everything organized. I know I was not one of them. I was absolutely the student whose mom dropped homework off more mornings than I would like to admit because I left it on my desk. So I think, repetition and practice are so important. I think when we're looking at executive function skills, there's really two different buckets. There are the skills that can be incorporated into a routine or be turned into a habit that our students just build, and it's part of the family routine, so it eventually becomes part of their personal routine, and it's something that they just automatically do. And then there are those skills that are going to require that conscious thought and that conscious dedication to get done. And it's important to figure out what system or what strategy a person or a young adult might need eventually to get those things done. I want to talk a little bit about routines and habits. There's a slight difference in kind of like the literature around them. Habits are associated with a cue. So an example would be washing your hands after you go to the bathroom. You use the restroom and then you immediately wash your hands. That's a habit. It's associated with something. A routine is more something that doesn't require conscious thought, sort of like a bedtime routine. A student's gonna start to feel tired and then they're gonna head up and they're just gonna know to brush their teeth. As you can see, the literature is really varied. It says it takes about 18 to 254 days in all the studies I kind of have reviewed. It's pretty varied and vast, but all I really see in that is that it takes less time than our students have at home during their childhood. If things are consistent, that's less than a year on the long end. So we definitely have the ability to build these routines if they're kind of intentional. So I wanted to transition now into some of kind of the most prominent executive function skills that I think can be targeted along this timeline, and kind of delve into each one of them and talk a little bit about steps that can be taken, when our students are elementary school, and then kind of how that progresses into independence as a young adult or an adolescent. So this time management piece, I am often told that I'm obsessive about a calendar, and I am, I'll admit. I think it's one of the biggest tools we have for helping our kids be self-directed and be independent. But that time management piece can start really early. It can start with little things like kids waking up to an alarm clock, even if parents have to go in and kind of wake them up again, just getting in that habit of having it and setting it in the evening. The calendar is such a huge tool, not only for things like kids knowing where they need to be, but starting to build a habit. Scheduling appointments is a big one. I know every time I go to the dentist or go to the doctor, they hand me a card that has my next appointment on it and things like that. I lose the card most of the time. But if we can start showing students that, like, when you get that card, that's a cue, and the first thing you do is open up your calendar and you put the information into the calendar with a notification, it starts to become a habit if at every dentist appointment and every doctor's appointment in the car before you drive home, that's what happens is you both pull out a calendar, or even if they're younger, you're pulling out a calendar and just showing them, look, this is what you do. This is card, means you put it in a calendar. Just modeling that behavior early can be really helpful, because when they're handed that card for the first time they go to a dentist appointment or a doctor's appointment on their own, they know, oh, this card means I need to pull out my calendar. And that starts to be something they do, but it can take years. It's not like we go to the doctor every week to build the habit, but if they do it every time they go to the doctor for 5 or 6 years, that starts to feel like a habit they can build and they can remember. The calendar also has the ability to set notifications for appointments. I've found that for some students, that transition from parent-directed scheduling and parent-directed just getting to appointments to self-directed is really difficult, and there has to be that digital step or that digital strategy continuously. I have some students who, if they have an appointment, we set a notification at 8 a.m., 1 hour before and 10 minutes before. Obviously, you want to start on eventually start to back that off and set less. But for some students, they're just going to need to know that they need 3 notifications. They need to be reminded in the morning. They need to be reminded with time to get ready. And then they need that quick reminder right before. Another thing that the calendar can be really important for is starting to create those internal deadlines. So recording deadlines for a paper that they might, hold off on, and they might end up doing it the last minute. If they set up internal deadlines and put them in the calendar with notifications, it's going to be reminding them, oh, I said I'd have my outline done by this day. I said I'd have my rough draft done by this day. So I think time management is one of those skills that we tend to just do for our students because it's so much easier to just do it and to just be in charge of it on our own. But including them slowly and just a little bit in the process, and then eventually kind of in the high school years, starting to expect them to take over some of that responsibility, even if you're also doing it behind the scenes, even if they're putting the doctor's appointment in the calendar, but it's also in your calendar in case they forget or in case they don't mention it. Just starts to build that responsibilities piece and starts to build up that appointment. One other suggestion, I know a lot of people use the refrigerator calendar or the whiteboard calendar that's in the home. I think changing our language around how we reference it can be really helpful. I think most of the time, if a student says when do I have that band recital, parent will just kind of jump back with oh, May 19th. It can be really helpful to just say, oh, you need to figure out when that is. Why don't you go check the calendar? I'm pretty sure it's on there. It just starts to develop that habit, that routine of I need to know something. This is my tool to check. This is where I go. Again, it's sometimes easier to just tell them, but if that little intentional step of just giving them the autonomy, you can find that out. Why don't you go check it? I know it's on the calendar, is really helpful for them to build that independence piece. The next thing I want to jump into is medication management. I don't know if this applies to all families. It applies to many families. This is a skill that can be really tough to build in the moment. And a lot of our students are sort of expected to learn all these things when they're 17 or 18 and they're about to head out of the home. But the more it can be incorporated into just a natural part of their childhood, the easier it often is. This is something I work on a lot in sessions with teenagers. I think the first step is to just find a pillbox that works well for your child. I put a couple of funky examples, but there are some pillboxes that have an auditory alarm or a vibrating alarm if kids keep them in their pocket that just reminds them when to take it. Some of them have just the days of the week. Some of them have morning, evening, night. It can be really helpful to make sure you find the right one. There's all different types. For some of our students who wouldn't necessarily be safe totally being in charge, there are some that are time dispensing. So, at noon every day, it's going to come out and land in a little cup. There's an alarm's going to go off and the student just needs to go grab it and take it. My biggest suggestion is to get kids involved as early as possible. I have a friend of mine who has a 5-year-old who takes medication, and every Sunday they sit down after dinner and they fill the pillbox together. It's actually a really great fine motor activity if it's really well supervised, because there's a lot of pinching and she's dropping them in each little box. It just becomes part of what they expect to do during their week, which is great because it becomes so normalized and it becomes built into their weekly routine. I think, like I said, like a specific time or a specific day. Some of our students like a notification or an alarm to go off daily to take it. Others really just want to build it into a habit. So, pairing daily medication with a daily task. I have a lot of students whose pillbox is right next to their toothbrush. And that just becomes completely paired. They know if I'm brushing my teeth, I'm taking my medication. And there are just kind of some little tricks to help build it into a routine, because we all have routines that already exist. Our kids brush their teeth in the morning. They brush their teeth before bed. That's an easy place to put it. Something I've also been working on pretty frequently with students is building out a medication chart. I find that a lot of our students don't know why they're on medication, which is understandable. A lot of kids change medication, or they're figuring out what works best, or they're, weaning off of one and trying a new dosage or something like that. But it can be really empowering, especially in conversations with their health practitioners, just to help them understand, like, why are you taking this medication? What is it called? What's the generic version called? What are potential side effects? It really helps them just feel confident in conversation. A lot of the time I'll put a picture of the pill on it. Jane really helpfully pointed out that it changes all the time and the generic version switches up and things can look different. That's great stuff for kids to start noticing and start learning that pills might look different, even though they're the same medication. And the last piece of medication management that is really important for kids to at least be aware of early is filling prescriptions. I swear this process just keeps getting more complicated in the different ways that it can be done and what needs to involve doctors and what just can be automatically refilled. But even just early on, when you get to the bottle, if you're filling the pill boxes together and the bottle has 5 pills, even just verbalizing, oh, look, there's only a few left. I need to refill your prescription. Even if they don't know what that means yet, if they're 5 or 6, they're hearing and they're starting to learn that only a few pills in a box means they need to refill their prescription. It starts to become a cue for them, and they'll start to notice when there's only a few left. Eventually, that can be listening to you refill a prescription on speakerphone. That can be looking at the app together if it's something that can be filled through an app, and then eventually, hopefully at least a year or so before they're going to be sort of venturing off on their own to do this independently, it's letting them trial taking it over with supervision, with check-in from you to say, like, did you do this? Are you on top of this? But giving them that chance to be independent with it before they leave the home is really important. Household management. This one's a little trickier to talk about. There's so many things that go into running a house, but there are a few things that can start to be incorporated into early on. Obviously, there are kind of those chore lists. I'll show one at the end of this presentation that I think is a pretty good one and pretty developmentally appropriate. But there are just a few little safety things and a few steps that if we start off early can be really helpful. My best friend was informed by her husband last year that you cannot mix bleach and ammonia. And just these little things that we don't think to teach or we don't think to pick up on, and our kids aren't going to absorb naturally. It's just being aware. It's just noticing, like, this is what you clean a bathroom with, this is what you clean a kitchen with, and just including them every so often helps to build that up. If just including them isn't going to work, creating lists, creating something that they can check off that's been done, creating a list of safety rules can be really helpful as well. Another big executive function piece of household management is cooking. Following a recipe is tricky. It's following directions. It's going step by step. And kids all have different kind of levels on what they're going to be able to do in terms of cooking. But I think the earlier we get them in the kitchen and the earlier we practice, the better they're going to be at kind of eventually doing things independently. Something I've done with quite a few students is start to create their own recipe book. Something that they've practiced, something that they know. And if you start that kind of the beginning of high school, there's a good chance they'll be able to go off to college with at least maybe 10 things that they know how to make, they know that they like, they know what they need to buy at the grocery store for it. It can be really helpful to kind of have their own cookbook. And it's just kind of fun to create. I've made quite a few of them, and they're pretty empowering for students to go off to college or go off to a transition program or wherever they're going to kind of take as their next step with that prior knowledge and that ability to feed themselves, even if it's just a pretty basic recipe. I wanted to check in on digital organization. I think a lot of the time we think that our kids are the master of technology and that this is the generation that, you know, can figure out any tablet and any iPad and any kind of operating system. And in many ways they are, but they're also the masters of digital shortcuts. They are the masters of searching for things. They can type things into a search bar and things will pop up and they'll kind of problem solve through that. But I find over and over again that nothing is organized and nothing is kind of simply set up in a way that is possible to find and possible to navigate. I think it can be really helpful to go through their Google Drive, to go through their email, to teach them how to organize things into folders, you know, to figure out the best way to save something. I find that a lot of students are just saving documents with whatever the first line is, because that's what auto-populates as the name. And that makes it impossible for them to find it later because it's not intuitive. And then the things that they think to search for are not what they titled it. I've worked a lot with students to come up with a format that they consistently use for every assignment, whether that be the teacher's last name, the year, and the name of the assignment. That can be really helpful. It saves so much time when they're trying to get assignments done. It does take a while. You know, it might take me 3 or 4 meetings with a client to get their desktop, like hard drive files and their Google Drive files all organized in a way that's easy to navigate. But once those systems are in place, I've always been quite impressed by how students can use them once they've been taught and once it's been set up. I think that this stuff kind of gets overlooked. Another thing to think about is where passwords are saved. Right now, a lot of the search engines, mainly Google and a few others, will sort of have a keychain or things auto-saved. If that works for students, that's okay, but a lot of the time it can really save them time and energy, and over and over hitting that forgot password button, to just have it somewhere written down, and to teach them. That can be different for each family. Some families are comfortable with them writing it into a notes tab on their phone. Some families want to have it handwritten in a desk drawer, but it can be really helpful for them to be able to just grab it and have a go-to place for it. It's sort of this process of just setting up these systems and these strategies so that they have a go-to. And often they'll carry these on once they leave, because they've been taught and it's something that they're used to doing. Want to move on to goal setting. This is where the executive function skills are going to kind of take a shift and feel a little bit more amorphous. The ones we were talking about were organization-based and initiation-based and really that planning piece. And now these are some of the ones that are a little higher level. So goal setting is something that not everybody does intentionally, not everybody writes it out, but most of us have goals that we're working towards. And it can be really helpful to sit down with our students and see what their goals are and help them to verbalize it, because it can be tricky. This is something that really popped up during remote learning. And I think, over summers, it really pops up every year, is kids aren't always great at filling their downtime or filling their free time. Things like, do you have a goal for what you'd like to read this year? Is there something that you would be really proud of getting done if you finished it this week? And then you can relate that back to something really concrete, like the calendar. Okay, so this is your goal. Your goal is to read 100 pages this week. Let's go to your calendar. Where do you have time in this that you could prioritize reading? Is it something you want to build as a habit, as something that you do kind of every day before bed? I did just get a question that I think is great, so I'm going to quickly answer it. It was about the digital organization. So it was, at what age would you suggest beginning to organize electronic files? Is too early overwhelming? I would suggest as early as possible, but that might be doing it for them and then kind of showing them. So if you have a folder set up, even if it just says like first grade, that one step of saying, look, every time you make a file, just drag it into the first grade file. Just put it right here, that's where it lives. And then your child's Google Drive eventually will say first, second, third, fourth, fifth. When you get to like the 5th grade file and open it, you might have math, social studies, English, science, but it just starts to create a structure and it starts to build that habit. So I would say as early as they are making their own electronic files. I wouldn't teach it when they're not using the computer, but once they start having to type things out and once they're saving things, the more routine and the more kind of simple it becomes for them. But those first steps are going to be really basic. it's high school when you start to get into like a specific name and putting it in a certain file and making sure that it's all attached to the right place. But the more they do it when they're younger, the more it just becomes part of the habit of saving. You know, they make sure to save as, they make sure to know where it's going. I've had students where we go into their computer and they don't know where anything is, and then you find it, and some of it's just been saved to whatever the last file was open, and that can take a really long time to kind of sort out. But I'll jump back to goal setting. Sorry for that little tangent. Goal setting is a great way to tie in other executive function skills. So like I was saying, the calendar, you can bring that in, you can create to-do lists, which are a great skill. You can practice checking things off. I always like to teach children to give themselves a win. I don't know about you guys, but if I have sent an email that I was putting off for a while, I might add it to my to-do list and check it off. Kids like that too, and it can be kind of fun. So just really figuring out a way to access goals and how to use those kind of more basic executive functioning skills helps with the higher level. So I did want to jump into this idea of helping versus taking over, because I think it's really, really difficult. Everyone's busy, everyone's juggling 100 different balls. And I think that it's much easier to just do things for our students. These are kind of the things that I hear. You know, as of right now, I am my daughter's frontal lobe. If I'm not sitting directly next to them, nothing's going to get done. He knows what he needs to do. He just will not do it. And it's really enticing to just jump in and do things and make sure that they get done. Like, I know it got done because I was there and I did it. There's a lot of research into executive function, and the biggest thing that kind of comes down, what it all comes down to, if you sort of distill it down to its core, is that executive function requires direct instruction. Like, our kids really do need to be taught, and then they need opportunity to practice, and part of practicing is failing. That leads to opportunities for problem solving and feeling natural consequences and all of that, but our kids are going to mess this stuff up, and that can be really tricky. So I do just like to acknowledge that it's hard to not help, and it's hard to let our kids what is the word I'm looking for? Occasionally have these executive function fails, but it's important, and it leads to growth, because that's how we grow. This leads into kind of this cycle of executive dysfunction. And this is what I would not let this is where I would jump in before a kid starts to kind of fail, is that if students really struggle with these pieces like organization, initiation, planning, task initiation, things like that, often the consequence leads to a need for more executive function skills, because solving a problem and fixing a mistake kind of often leads to a need to do more. So if you don't plan things out and you don't have internal deadlines, then you get stuck in this place where you really need to figure out what to prioritize and how to get this done. And do I need to communicate with the teacher and ask for an extension? And is that going to take me a while to draft that email because I'm not super strong at writing emails yet? So that's somewhere I wouldn't necessarily let kids just have to problem solve all on their own, but it's definitely something you can support and let them know, like, look, this is something that pops up. But so it does get cyclical. And when I say let kids kind of have a few failures and have a few times where they need to problem solve, I would jump in before they get into this kind of cyclical pattern. I wanted to talk a little bit more about that problem solving piece, because I'm a huge believer in natural consequences. At the end of this presentation, I have a link to a blog that I have a series going right now that is executive function tools and tips. And one of them is natural consequences and just how important that can be. But problem solving is also something that needs to be taught and needs to be kind of reviewed with students throughout their childhood. I like showing this transition tool Something we do at NESCA is comprehensive transition assessment. I do them as well as OT assessment. And this is one of my favorite sort of supplemental informal assessments that I just will often add into a transition assessment. And it's figuring out how students can problem solve with things that might pop up. Some of these probably won't pop up, but it's just to see sort of what their answers are and see how they're doing with that in the moment problem solving. This first one, you're watching TV when you smell something like rotten eggs, you think it might be a gas leak, so I often have students say that they would light a candle because it smells bad. Not the safest response. I have some students who have learned that gas is flammable and they will just say, I would get out of the house. It's a great answer. It's little things like these that just can be really tricky to teach, but if you're always sort of looking for those moments throughout the day, like if you're having a barbecue and somebody says, oh, it kind of smells like gas, it can be great to say to a kid, this is what gas smells like. Gas is flammable. If you smell that smell, you should probably get out of the house. I'm often surprised by the ones that students give really solid answers and the ones that students don't, although this third one, I would say 95% of students give me a great answer. It's you're home alone, you hear the knob on the front door turn, it's locked, but the person keeps fiddling with the latch. You think the person's trying to break in, so you. I find that students have reviewed this with their parents if they are old enough to stay home alone. And so they're able to give a good answer. A lot of them will either say, I'd go hide somewhere in my house and call my mom, or I would call 911 and I'd go to my bedroom. Most students will say I wouldn't open the door, or I might go upstairs and peek out the window and see if it's somebody I know. But I get good answers to that. And I think it's because it's been reviewed. And I just think that that's a great indicator that our kids are listening. And those things that we target, they are learning. So here are sort of my overall tips or tricks for building executive function. My first one is schedule weekly meetings. These can be very quick, but they're really helpful, whether you want to do goal setting, whether you want to check in about medication, whether you want to check in about a chore that you'd like them to do this week, or if you want to, plan this week, we're going to learn where the fuse box is in case we lose power and you want to know how to problem solve that, and you can go, switch the fuse. I have a few students they've been away at college and they're living in not a dorm anymore, they're living in an apartment, and a fuse is blown and we have our session and they're in the dark, and I'll say, why are you in the dark? And they'll say, well, I don't know, I need to call an electrician. Half of the power in my house just went out. I'm going to call an electrician after we hang up. And I could say, do you know where the fuse box is? And then they'll put me on FaceTime and we'll go flick the fuse, and they're amazed that, it was a quick fix and there was a way to do it. Just building in these little things can be really helpful. Compare calendars and get them using their own early, even if it feels sort of redundant. Having a kid in 7th grade have a Google alert that goes off the morning of his doctor's appointment is awesome. You probably already reminded him about it. When you're picking him up to go to it, it's in your plan, but just getting that cue on their own can really be helpful. Allow children to have natural consequences. That seems really vague. When we think about natural consequences for kids who are younger, it can be like if they refuse to eat anything you made for dinner, well, they might be a little bit hungry after. If they absolutely refuse to wear a coat on a day that's 55 degrees, but they're going to be inside most of the day, they might be a little cold waiting in line. That's a natural consequence that eventually builds behavior in terms of like, I'll eat some of this so I'm not hungry. I'll put a coat on so I'm not cold next time. In high school, this gets a little more complicated, but an example that I like to use is I had a student who kept missing a tutoring session, but there was a fee for missing the tutoring session. Eventually, his parents just told him, if you miss another one, it's coming out of your bank account. He missed another one. They went and they took him to the bank. He had to withdraw the money from his account. He needed to go and, give it to the tutoring company. He stopped missing them. Once kids feel that consequence, that can be really helpful. We have using chore charts. I'll have a link here if you guys want to look for one that I think is pretty great. As I mentioned, I love school staff. I think they're masters. And if there's a specific thing that you need help with, or a specific executive function piece that you might need some scaffolding, I would reach out and say, I'm really trying to get them to do this. I might need a visual. And then consider executive function coaching. I think that can be helpful if it feels like something that's really tricky to tackle in the home. I do have some resources here that I can definitely provide to everybody, but I wanted to leave some time for questions before people have to head out. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for now and see if there's anything that people would like to check in about.